The husband mocked his wife when he found out what she had inherited in the remote village. But when he decided to check on how she was doing, Victoria had been in a state of confusion all day after receiving unexpected news. She had inherited a cowshed located in a village. The notification had arrived at her workplace, leaving her in shock at first. Victoria spent several minutes reading the document, trying to comprehend that just a few moments ago she had become the owner of a small plot of land, complete with cows. The inheritance came from her paternal grandfather, with whom she hadn't spoken for many years. Since her parents divorced when she was a child, her connection with her father's relatives had almost disappeared. For example, her grandfather, who left her the cowshed, had only seen her about 5 times throughout his life. Victoria thought that no one would remember her, especially since her father had started a new family and had other children. However, her grandfather not only remembered her but had chosen her as his heir. "Thank you," Victoria silently thought, touched by the gesture. "Are you going to keep staring at that spot, or will you help me give this injection?" her colleague asked good-naturedly. Valeria was holding a huge ginger cat that had already scratched her arms several times. "Sorry, I'm coming," Victoria said, quickly putting the document in her bag. She worked as a veterinary assistant, and she couldn't afford to daydream because she was responsible for the lives and health of 4-legged friends. Now she had to hold the restless cat still so her colleague could finally give it an injection. When Victoria returned home, her husband was already there. Without wasting a moment, she told him about the inheritance. William's reaction was, to say the least, strange. He burst into long laughter, which kept him from speaking right away. "Are you going to be the mistress of the cows now?" he asked, unable to hide a mocking smile. "What's so funny?" Victoria frowned. "I think I should be grateful that someone actually thought of me." "Ugh, they should have left you something more useful," William muttered. "A car, for example, or a big house. But a cowshed? You're actually happy about it?" "I'm embarrassed to tell anyone that my wife now owns a cowshed." Victoria simply shook her head and went to the kitchen. She completely disagreed with him and didn't see anything shameful in owning a cowshed. The next morning, William was laughing about the story at his real estate agency job, where he had been working for several years. A small group of colleagues gathered around him, listening to his tale with amused smiles. When people started dispersing, an attractive woman with a short haircut approached William. Her name was Ursula, and she also worked at the agency. "I checked out that property you sent me yesterday," she said, smirking. "Don't expect any good reviews from the appraiser." William nodded. He wasn't expecting much from the cowshed. Looking around and realizing that they were now alone in the office, Ursula moved from her chair to William's lap. He wrapped his arm around her waist. "What about the land?" he asked. At that moment, Ursula's eyes gleamed slyly. "Now that's the right question. If we sell the plot, we could make some decent money," she winked. William grinned. This woman had a great knack for business. That's how they met, both working on a property project. William was looking for buyers, while Ursula was handling property evaluations. The passion between them flared up like a match. At first, they just met in hotels on weekends, but then their relationship developed. They officially became lovers, keeping things secret because no one at work had any idea about their affair. "Have you already found a buyer?" William asked with a grin. "Maybe I have," Ursula flirted. Ursula had indeed found a potential buyer, the owner of a hotel chain. Though the house was in poor condition, it had a breathtaking view of the river, which immediately appealed to the client. The location was what hooked Stephen Fitzgerald. Since Ursula had already started negotiating with him, she sent him a photo of the plot. The businessman liked it, as it reminded him of the house he once shared with his first wife. She had suffered from a long illness and passed away after several years of fighting. Left alone with his young son, Sylvester, Stephen had been deeply affected by the loss. For a while, he abandoned his work and rarely left the house, but after months, he learned to live again, especially for the sake of his son. A couple of years later, Stephen remarried. His new wife, Christina, was completely different, arrogant, and impulsive, the complete opposite of his gentle first wife. Christina had trouble getting along with her stepson, as children can quickly sense hypocrisy, and Sylvester immediately felt that his stepmother was pretending to be kind while actually being a true shrew. The second wife constantly nagged the child, trying to drive a wedge between him and his father. She was irritated that Stephen put his son before her, so she wanted him to send Sylvester to a camp or boarding school for as long as possible. "You're the best," William said enthusiastically, sensing a successful deal. He only needed to convince his wife, which he thought would be easy. "You'll get your share," Ursula said, playfully winking at him before standing up quickly. Ursula ran off to work, and William watched her with a lingering gaze. What a woman! Not like my clumsy wife, he thought. That evening, when the Fishers had dinner together, William brought up the idea of selling the cowshed. He gave several reasons why keeping the animals wasn't profitable, and if Victoria took this seriously, she would just face losses. Victoria listened to him quietly, occasionally poking at her food with a fork. Her whole being resisted this idea. She felt that selling the inheritance would be betraying her grandfather's memory. Even though she hadn't been close to him, she had deeply respected him. And besides, her husband continued, I know someone who's already ready to make you a good offer. If you don't act foolishly, we could sell your inheritance in the next few days. Such urgency made Victoria uneasy. She hadn't even gotten used to her new property, and now her husband wanted to take it from her. No, William, that's not going to happen, Victoria shook her head. I'm not ready to sell anything yet. And I don't think I'll ever be ready, she added silently to herself, but didn't say it out loud. Recently, Victoria had started looking into the matter and learned that there were still some animals kept in the cowshed. After her grandfather passed, the kind neighbors didn't abandon the animals, they took care of them and in return took the milk. Victoria thought this system was fair. What do you mean you're not ready? William frowned. What is this, childish nonsense? We're talking about a good amount of money. William, not everything in life is measured by money, she replied vaguely, and that ended the conversation. Fisher was disappointed, as he was sure his wife would, as always, listen to him, but this time she unexpectedly showed some backbone. The next day, near the end of her shift, just as Victoria was about to leave, a man entered the veterinary clinic. Since he didn't have any pets with him, she assumed he wanted to buy some product. How can I help you? Victoria asked with her usual smile, the one she always used when greeting clients. I need Victoria Fisher, the stranger said. I'm right here, she smiled, adjusting her name tag. My name is Stephen. I spoke with your husband about buying the plot in the village. However, he says you're against it, so I'm here to try to convince you otherwise. Victoria widened her eyes in surprise. She thought the issue was already settled, and everyone had accepted her decision to keep the inheritance. William, why don't you ever listen to me, she thought, disappointed in her husband who hadn't turned down the potential buyer. She had to politely repeat to the businessman everything she had already explained to William the day before, but unlike her husband, Fitzgerald listened to her calmly, without interrupting, although he clearly didn't like the decision either. So, if I understand correctly, your main reason for refusing is your desire to keep the cowshed? The businessman asked diplomatically. Victoria nodded in agreement. Well then, let's do this, Stephen said enthusiastically, his idea taking shape. I'll arrange to move the cowshed to another plot. Of course, I'll personally make sure the animals are well taken care of. You'll only sell me the land. How does that sound? She thought deeply. The new offer seemed much more appealing than the previous one. All the costs for relocating the cows will, of course, be on me, the businessman added. Believe me, I don't need the cowshed. I just want to buy the plot with the beautiful view of the river, and I'm willing to pay generously for it. For Stephen, this purchase had become a matter of principle, he wasn't about to back down. In all his dealings, he was used to getting what he wanted. It didn't matter if it was business, personal life, or a simple purchase, the businessman always went all the way. Victoria looked at him carefully. Fitzgerald didn't seem like a trickster trying to deceive someone. He seemed sincere and honest, so she eventually agreed. Besides, she had no intention of living in her grandfather's house, nor did she see it as a summer home. The money from the sale would be enough to build new cow sheds, even better and stronger than the old ones. "All right, I agree to the sale," Victoria sighed, and they shook hands. Since he had all the documents with him, the sales agreement was signed right there in the veterinary clinic. Victoria didn't even feel guilty about it in front of her late grandfather. After all, he had left her the cow shed, not the house, which, to be honest, was in poor condition and required urgent repairs. On her way home, she smiled, feeling that everything was falling into place. After the sale, the animals would get new housing, and where the old, dilapidated house stood, a new home would rise, and another family would live there and find their happiness. This deal also brought joy to another woman who was talking on the phone with her lover. "I don't know what you told her, but your wife actually sold the plot," Ursula said with a smirk, pleased with her commission from the sale and now very content. "She finally came around," William sighed. "She kept saying, 'I'm not ready to sell the plot. I told you, I'm a born diplomat,'" he added without much modesty. They talked for a few more minutes on the phone before William heard the door open and his wife enter. In the interest of secrecy, he quickly said goodbye to his lover and returned to his role as the devoted husband. Victoria told him about the deal, and he pretended to be surprised, acting like he was hearing this news for the first time. But the deal didn't make everyone happy. Christina, who was listening to her husband, smiled sweetly, but inside she was seething with irritation. "Why do we need that house? It's so far away. And those awful locals," she thought, frustrated. When she heard about the relocation of the cow shed, she barely managed to hold back laughter. Has she really got nothing better to do? Christina continued thinking. Can you imagine how great it will be when I bring Sylvester to this house? The businessman thought dreamily. Fresh air, the river, nature, the views, he will definitely like it. I also plan to put a football field nearby, so I can play with my son. And in the mornings, we can go fishing. Yeah, great idea. Christina smiled through her teeth. She understood very well that she couldn't resist Stephen's will for now, and complaining wouldn't help, especially when he was so fanatically dreaming about all of this. Just don't tell Sylvester about this yet, her husband asked. I want to surprise him. Christina nodded. When he left for another room, she finally wiped the fake smile off her face. He should have bought me a new car instead. Christina muttered grumpily. I've been driving the old one for 2 years, and he doesn't care. After the conversation with her husband, she called her friend to vent and release the pent-up frustration. Stephen didn't waste any time and immediately began the construction of the new house. He waited for the nearest weekend and headed to the village. He offered Christina to come along, but she tactfully declined. The businessman contacted the builder to discuss the house project and the cowshed relocation, and he even managed to hire some workers to begin demolishing the old house. However, Fitzgerald never reached his destination. The hired workers waited for him for several hours before they became alarmed. It turned out that Stephen had been involved in a terrible accident. As he was turning toward the village, a drunk driver crashed into him at full speed. The drunk driver was completely unharmed, not even a scratch, but the businessman suffered severe head injuries. The glass of his car shattered, and the shards fell directly on him. Fitzgerald was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery. Several doctors fought to save his life, and for a while, they managed to stabilize his condition. However, a few hours later, he slipped into a coma. Christina, who immediately rushed to the clinic, was shocked. She received a call from the concerned builders who hadn't waited for the client. So, the work hasn't started yet? The businessman's wife asked. No, we only managed to discuss a few details, the builder explained. The final decision on the project was supposed to be made today. Christina's eyes glinted mischievously. she snapped out of her shock and realized that the whole situation was in her favor. "You know, right before the accident, I spoke with Steven," Christina quickly started to invent. "And he said he changed his mind about building the house. He even wants to sell the plot. So, we no longer need your services," she said with a smile, then turned on her high heels and hurried out of the hospital. Now, the house in the village and its adjoining cow shed were in Christina's greedy hands. She immediately contacted Ursula to resell the property. The appraiser was surprised by the urgency but honestly didn't care about the fate of the plot. She was only concerned with her commission, which could now increase even more. Christina even managed to arrange for the cowshed to be demolished, so by the time the rightful heir found out, the process was already underway. Workers were already demolishing the structure, and special vehicles were at work. Victoria received a call from a concerned neighbor who was very worried about the fate of the cows. "What do you mean, it's demolished?" Victoria exclaimed into the phone, her calm demeanor now shattered. "It can't be. Steven promised me they would just be moved to another location." "My dear, do you really think I'm lying to you?" the neighbor said in a sad voice. "I'm right here watching as some people destroy everything. You can come and see for yourself." Victoria took the day off from work and rushed to the village. When she arrived, she was met with ruins and a few cows wandering around aimlessly. She felt so hurt that she couldn't hold back her tears. The only thing she could do to save the animals was to give them to the locals. That way, at least the cows wouldn't die or risk getting hit by cars if they wandered onto the road. "Thank you for the cow, dear," the neighbors thanked her. "If you ever need help, don't hesitate to ask." Victoria nodded. Even though the support was small, it was still a comfort. Usually, the locals weren't very fond of city folk, but they treated her with special warmth. Much of it was due to the fact that her grandfather, Victor, was very loved and respected by everyone. He always responded to any call for help and was known for his kind heart, so the same attitude extended to his granddaughter. Victoria returned home disappointed. She regretted trusting the businessman as he had deceived her so cruelly. Most likely, Steven never intended to keep his promise. He had simply talked her into giving up the land to take control of the valuable plot. What a fool I am. I'll never trust a stranger again, Victoria thought tensely. "I don't know where you found this businessman, but he turned out to be a real scoundrel," she said accusingly when she saw her husband. She told him everything that had happened today. William didn't really listen to her words because all his thoughts were occupied with Ursula, with whom he planned to spend the evening. Victoria was supposed to be on call at the veterinary clinic all night, so her husband didn't worry about her. But to his surprise, she returned home. And now, he had to come up with something, as the hotel room was already booked, and his lover was on her way there. "Yeah, it's a tough situation," William muttered, glancing at the time. "A tough situation?" his wife asked indignantly. "Is that all you can say? Let me remind you that you were the one who introduced me to Steven. If you had listened to me when I said I didn't want to sell anything, this situation would never have happened." Now, William tensed up. Being a vain person, he couldn't stand when someone spoke to him like that. "You're saying I'm to blame for all of this?" He started boiling with anger. "If you hadn't been so gullible, you would have realized you were being deceived, and now you're just transferring all the blame to me." Victoria felt hurt by his words. She had expected her husband to support her, but instead, they just argued. After retreating to her room, she heard the front door slam shut. Looking at the time, she frowned. Where could he be going at this hour, she wondered, but since she was angry with him, she didn't text him and just went to bed. Meanwhile, Christina managed to find a new buyer for the plot. It wasn't hard since the view really was fantastic, and no one was bothered by the dilapidated remains of the house. Fitzgerald was already rubbing her hands in anticipation, eager to finalize the deal and pocket the money. Even though she was married to a wealthy man, Stephen was not one to throw money around. They maintained a respectable standard of living, but expensive things or outrageously expensive jewelry were rare purchases for her. Christina wanted those things, especially when many of her friends had them. She was already imagining how a large sum would soon be deposited into her account, and she would spend it all at her favorite store. Christina often called Stephen's doctor to check on her husband's condition. She didn't want to visit him in the hospital herself, as she hated the hospital atmosphere, and the sight of patients depressed her, so Fitzgerald limited herself to phone calls. While her husband remained in a coma, the doctors couldn't say anything definitive. So, Christina decided he wouldn't recover and began to act on his behalf. She no longer worried that her husband might wake up and make things difficult for her. "Christina, when are we going to see Dad?" Sylvester asked, tugging at the hem of her dress. His stepmother just sighed. The child had been asking her that question almost every day, and it was starting to get on her nerves. "Sylvester, as soon as we can," she said dismissively. "Stop asking me the same thing, go do your homework instead." She turned the disappointed boy around and sent him back to his room. Because of the situation with the cowsheds, Victoria was in a depressed mood. She loved her job, and people usually saw her with a smile on her face, but in the last few days, she had been walking around like a ghost, constantly lost in her thoughts. Now she regretted not only losing the cowshed but also the money she had yet to receive. It seemed Stephen had just deceived her, and she needed to do something about it. But since this was the first time she found herself in such a situation, she didn't even know where to turn. Her distress didn't escape the attention of the chief veterinarian, who asked her what was wrong. Rudolph Gerald was an older man, and with his wealth of life experience, he was a trusted colleague. The atmosphere in their small team was friendly, so Victoria often shared her problems with him, and this time was no exception. She openly told him everything. "Well, first of all, you should speak to this person in person," the veterinarian said, referring to the businessman. Victoria sighed. After everything that had happened, she least of all wanted to see Stephen. "Yes, you're probably right," Victoria reluctantly admitted. "Looks like I'll have to do that." Rudolph looked at her skeptically. He knew that her husband had been unfaithful. He had seen William and Ursula together several times and didn't doubt their affair. The veterinarian felt that her husband wasn't making Victoria happy, and he had begun to dislike him more and more. But how could he tell Victoria, who was already dealing with a tough situation? He respected his colleague greatly and was concerned about her feelings, but it was also clear that he couldn't stay silent anymore. He couldn't just let this scoundrel keep deceiving such a good person. "You know, Victoria, I think you should go somewhere, get distracted," the elderly man suggested. "And where should I go?" She smirked. "How about the new cafe that opened on the street nearby?" The veterinarian quickly came up with a suggestion. It was there that he had often seen the lovers, so he decided to let fate take its course. If it was meant to be, Victoria would definitely see them and draw the right conclusions. "Well, I'm not sure," she said doubtfully. Go. He insisted. "They make wonderful coffee there. You drink it by the gallon here, so you're sure to love it." Victoria smiled, promising to go. After all, the cafe was only a few minutes' walk from her work. After her shift, she decided to follow through. "I'll have a cappuccino and—" The word tiramisu was almost ready to leave her lips when Victoria spotted her husband. William was lounging on the couch, talking animatedly with an unfamiliar woman. He was holding her hand, and in the next moment, he leaned in closer and kissed her on the neck. "And?" The waiter smiled, awaiting her order. "Nothing, just water," Victoria said hoarsely. She continued watching her husband. With each passing minute, she became more and more certain that William was spending time with his mistress. Maybe that's why Mr. Gerald urged me to come here, Victoria thought, shaking her head. As she tried to collect herself, the couple's behavior grew more and more brazen. At some point, Victoria couldn't take it anymore, grabbed her glass, and made her way over to them. "Is this how you're staying late at work?" she said sharply, shooting a glare at her husband. William froze in shock at the sight of her. "Victoria," he said with trembling lips, quickly removing his hand from Ursula's waist. "What are you doing here? Does it matter?" "Believe me, it's not what you think," William started to defend himself. "Ursula and I are just colleagues. Her dress got caught on the chair, and I bent down to help." It sounded so ridiculous that Victoria became even angrier. Her husband kept mumbling, piling on more and more lies. To make it stop, she suddenly splashed the water on him. It happened so unexpectedly that his mistress couldn't hold back a laugh. Victoria then threw the glass in her direction. However, Ursula got more than just water, as Victoria didn't calculate the force and the glass flew with the water straight at her. "Are you completely insane?" Ursula screeched, immediately pulling out a compact mirror to fix her makeup. "You should be thanking me that I didn't order coffee," Victoria replied coldly, then turned to William and added, "Don't bother coming home. I'm sure you have somewhere to go." "Victoria," her husband said, but she raised her hand, signaling him to be silent. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow," she said, and then walked out of the room so that those two wouldn't see her tears. She least wanted to show her weakness to that traitor and his mistress. Since they didn't have children, the divorce would be quick, which was especially relieving because after such a betrayal, Victoria didn't even want to carry the last name of a cheater. It hurt incredibly. She had devoted herself completely to William, and he had treated her so despicably. Remembering all the times her husband lied about staying late at work or going on business trips made her feel disgusted. Now, every word of his seemed like nothing but vile deception. At some point, Victoria realized that in this life, she could only rely on herself. There were only liars around, so even with the closest people, one had to stay alert. "Yeah, lately I've been too trusting," Victoria muttered to herself as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. "It's time to put an end to this." She was so furious that she immediately went to Fitzgerald's house. A fiery speech had already been prepared in her head, and she planned to unleash it on this vile liar. Her hands itched to slap his lying face. But all these feelings instantly evaporated when she saw a small boy in an adorable bear-patterned pajama. "Hello," he said politely, and she couldn't help but notice how deep and sad his eyes were. Victoria explained that she needed to speak with his father, and the boy's face fell even more. "Daddy isn't here right now," Sylvester said quietly. "He's in a coma, and Christina says he won't wake up." He looked like he was about to cry. At that moment, the visitor, who was shocked by this news, crouched down and gently patted him on the back. "You know, I know people who came back from that, and then lived very long lives," she smiled. "Really?" The boy's eyes widened. Victoria nodded. "You just need to believe, really believe that your dad will wake up," she explained. "Then he will definitely feel that you're thinking about him, and that will bring him back. The key is not to lose hope." Sylvester promised her that he wouldn't fall into despair again, and they said their goodbyes. Victoria rubbed her temples in distress. So all this time, while she had blamed Stephen for the deception, he had been fighting for his life and hadn't been thinking of abandoning her. He had just become a victim of the same circumstances as her. But this man had it far worse, as his own life was on the line. "Oh my God, I think I've completely lost my mind," Victoria muttered, hiding her face in her hands. "How could I accuse someone without knowing anything about them?" She felt incredibly ashamed. She had to find out the hospital's address where the businessman was staying and head there. To see Fitzgerald, she had to pretend to be his sister. Only then was she allowed into the ward. The businessman was lying motionless, connected to dozens of wires. It even took her breath away. His appearance now resembled a scene from a movie where the main character dies at the end. "He'll wake up, right?" she asked, almost like a naive child. "It's hard to say," the doctor admitted. "We monitor him every day, but we still can't give a definitive prognosis." Victoria sighed deeply. She wouldn't wish this on anyone, not even her own husband. Suddenly, she heard the doctors talking about how, after many weeks, Fitzgerald's wife had finally come to see him. She quickly decided to leave before the deception was uncovered. "No, I don't need to see him." Christina dismissed them right outside the ward. "Just turn off these things, and that's it." At these words, Victoria froze. She couldn't believe that Fitzgerald's wife could say such a thing. "Are you sure?" The doctor, also shocked by this request, asked after a few minutes of silence. "Yes, we really can't say what will happen next, but your husband still has a chance. Believe me, sometimes people wake up from comas after years." Christina muttered, looking at her phone. "I believe you. But I've already made my decision. I don't want to deal with a vegetable, and I don't wish that fate on him either. My husband hasn't woken up in a very long time, so our whole family has accepted it. Keeping him alive would cost too much money. Trust me, now I handle the finances," she added businesslike. "Of course, it's your choice," the doctor said. "But I strongly advise you to wait." They proceeded to the chief physician's office, and from that point on, Victoria couldn't hear the rest of the conversation. However, it was enough for the puzzle in her mind to click into place. So that's who's responsible for the demolition of the cow shed, she finally realized. Christina had indeed already begun to involve herself in her husband's business. She had successfully sold the plot of land to the developers, who planned to build a vacation cottage on the site. Since the location was truly picturesque, there was a fierce competition among buyers, and Fitzgerald managed to sell it for a higher price, securing for herself a lifetime free pass to the cottage once it was built. Of course, this development didn't sit well with the locals. They had grown used to a calm, peaceful life, and this new neighbor wasn't welcome. While they could forgive the construction of a new home for a wealthy person, especially since Victoria had mentioned that he was a good man, they were not willing to tolerate the creation of a party hub that the rich would inevitably bring with them. "I know these kinds of cottages," one of the villagers lamented. "They're full of endless drunken parties and brawls. You should watch the news, they often show the horrors that happen in places like that." The other villagers supported him. They didn't want the decadence and depravity that these wealthy people would bring to poison their clean, fresh village air. The locals wouldn't just quietly complain. Soon, they were taking concrete actions. Every day, they went outside with posters, organized rallies, and sent complaints to the administration, hoping to burden the developers with endless inspections. Thus, a serious battle broke out between the villagers and the developers, with neither side willing to back down. Victoria was aware of what was happening in the village, and she was proud that the residents were fighting so fiercely for their nature, but she didn't participate herself. First of all, she didn't believe anything would come of it, and second, she was too consumed with her own problems. First and foremost, there was the divorce to handle. Despite the lack of children, William still intended to take the matter to court. After all, they had purchased an apartment and a car in their marriage, and he didn't plan to give them up without a fight. Ursula had been actively encouraging him to claim those assets, which was likely why Fisher would have agreed to a peaceful divorce otherwise. But despite her personal issues, Victoria continued to visit Stephen in the hospital, since no one else was doing so. She felt a sense of responsibility toward him and simply couldn't abandon him. Christina no longer appeared at the hospital. She was busy with other matters, deeply involving herself in her husband's business, and now she had started to take an interest in his son. The businessman's wife had always suggested Stephen send Sylvester to a camp so the boy wouldn't be in the way, but Stephen had always opposed it. Now, Christina had found a place that might not have been an orphanage in the traditional sense, but it served all its functions. She had been advised about it by a friend who had successfully shipped her husband's daughter from his first marriage there, and now she lived happily with him. "Get ready, Sylvester, you're going to a kids' camp soon," Christina said mockingly, which only scared the boy. "I don't want to go anywhere." The boy shouted. "I want to stay with Dad." "Your dad won't be helped by anything now," said the stepmother. "It's just a matter of turning off the machines, and that's it." "You're mean," he cried out, running to his room. Despite all the hardships, Victoria found solace in the cow shed. Grateful villagers, to whom she had given all the animals for free, decided to rebuild the cow sheds themselves. Through her neighbor, Victoria kept in touch with them and was aware of everything happening in the village. When your cows give birth to calves, we can continue Victor's work, her neighbor cheerfully told her over the phone. I'd really like that, Victoria admitted. Once I sort out my problems, she sighed, hinting at the divorce. Don't worry, dear, the elderly woman reassured her. Everything will be fine. Despite the fact that the developers were working tirelessly and the village was in active conflict with them, the villagers still worked on the cowshed. On weekends or in the evenings after shifts, they all gathered to build the pens. One day, they accidentally found a chest, and it took several people to lift it because it was very heavy. Could it be treasure? One of the villagers joked. But once they looked inside, the joke turned into reality. It really is, his friend grinned. It was most likely left there by workers from a mining company that had been located in the area 40 years ago. There had been many legends about it, and until now, everyone thought they were just stories. They immediately informed Victoria. At first, she didn't believe it, thinking the villagers were just joking, but soon she saw it with her own eyes. She decided to do the right thing and not hide this discovery. So, according to the law, she handed it over to the state and received a reward in the form of a quarter. This money came at the perfect time since, at that very moment, Christina officially refused to pay for Stephen's life support. Victoria then made the payment for several months in advance. Stephen's doctor studied her closely, and though he had long figured out that she wasn't really the patient's sister, he continued to remain silent. He himself was disgusted by the actions of the businessman's wife and hoped Stephen would recover. "You're doing a good thing," he said. "Well, I just hope it bears fruit," Victoria sighed, gazing at the peacefully sleeping businessman. When Christina was informed about it, she didn't even raise an eyebrow. "Well, if that fool wants to keep wasting her money, let her have her fun," she replied indifferently. "I don't care about it." Fitzgerald was eagerly awaiting the moment when she would become a widow and don black clothes. Then she would have full access to all her husband's savings and could delve even deeper into his business. Even now, she had her hands tied, but Christina aimed for more, wanting to become the full-fledged mistress of all his wealth. Victoria reclaimed her grandfather's plot by buying it back from the developers. This turned out to be no easy task, as they were holding on tightly to the land. She had to come up with a story about the house being on unstable ground, with many crazy people nearby who often came there at night. In the end, the developers abandoned the idea of building the cottage. The villagers were overjoyed. It was their collective victory. Victoria used part of the money to develop her own farm. Naturally, the locals helped her a lot, but professional workers were also necessary. She also bought new equipment to make everyone's work easier. Once her grandfather Victor's legacy was revived, and the village had its farm again, Victoria started filling job positions. She offered them to her neighbors, as she knew them well and trusted them. These people had proven their loyalty and skill with their hands, so there were no doubts. Everyone was happy, the farm was operational, the cows had their purpose, and the villagers received a stable income. That's what inheritance is like. Victoria smirked, realizing that at the start, she hadn't imagined how much she'd have to go through. After 2 months in a coma, Stephen finally woke up. It happened late at night, but the doctors quickly noticed and responded. According to the rules, they were supposed to notify close family members immediately, but the treating physician thought differently. A few weeks earlier, he had asked Victoria to leave her number, so he could inform her about any changes in Stephen's condition, and so she was the first to hear the news. "He's awake," she repeated breathlessly, feeling shivers all over her body. At that moment, Victoria was in the village, but upon hearing such good news, she immediately headed to the hospital. "How are you feeling?" Victoria asked when she was allowed to visit the patient. "A bit strange," the businessman admitted. "They told me I've been asleep for 2 months, but it feels like I saw you just yesterday, and those 2 months didn't even happen. It's like time stopped for me." Victoria smiled. No matter how it sounded, she would gladly have taken a few months off from life to let her problems resolve on their own. "Well, the important thing is that months didn't turn into years," Victoria smiled. You're right about that, Stephen agreed. How's the plot? Is the relocation still happening? His question led to a long conversation. By the end of it, the businessman looked quite grim. I'll arrange for the money to be sent to you right now, he said firmly, reaching for the phone on the nightstand. Oh, God, that doesn't matter right now, Victoria said. There's time for that later. She tried to grab his hand, but something went wrong, and they bumped heads. Both of them laughed at the awkward moment. Sorry, he smirked, squinting at her. It's okay, I'm the one who's at fault, she said. After the hospital visit, Victoria felt lighter. The news of Stephen waking up seemed like the happiest news in a long time. It wasn't until a day later that the doctors informed Stephen's wife that he had woken up from the coma. Christina was stunned. She had already started mourning him, and now he had woken up. This is so inconvenient, she thought to herself. At that moment, she had almost sent the child to a daycare center, and there was a great buyer lined up for Stephen's company, promising a huge sum of money by her standards. Now she had to cancel everything, and with a sour expression, she went to the hospital. By the time she arrived, Stephen was already aware of everything. The treating physician had told him that during his time in a coma, his wife hadn't visited him even once, and his life was entirely thanks to Victoria, aside from his colleagues. She didn't even mention this, the businessman thought, stunned. Darling, Christina exclaimed, trying to embrace him. How happy I am that you finally come back. But Stephen pulled away and gave her such a fierce look that she stepped back. Let's skip the theatrics, he grimaced. Instead, tell me, where is my son? At home with the nanny, she immediately replied. Why didn't you bring him? The businessman frowned. Christina mumbled something incoherent, claiming she didn't want to traumatize the child further. Stephen just smirked and shook his head. You know, in difficult times, it really shows what people are made of, he started in a low voice. And you've shown your true colors. What do you mean by that? Christina asked anxiously. I know everything, Stephen said coldly. I know every action you took while I was gone. Every single one, he emphasized. Christina swallowed nervously. She was afraid of her husband in this state. You have 24 hours to disappear from my life forever, Stephen said clearly. After that, my lawyer will contact you regarding the divorce. Christina was ready to fall to her knees, begging for forgiveness, but when she saw his cold stare, she shivered. More than anything, she wanted to run as far as possible from him to avoid feeling the contempt he was directing at her, which she could even feel physically. The next time Victoria visited Stephen, there was a stack of money waiting for her on the nightstand. This is for everything you've done for me. I'm very grateful, he said. You do understand that I didn't do all this for the money, right? Victoria asked. Well, you amaze me, Stephen said. I've met many women in my life, but none of them had such a kind heart. Victoria was embarrassed. She just shrugged, not knowing how to respond to the compliment. Will you come tomorrow? Stephen asked, hope in his voice. Unfortunately, I can't, she shook her head. I have a divorce tomorrow. Fitzgerald couldn't help but chuckle with satisfaction. He hadn't immediately remembered that Victoria was married, but when he realized it, his mood soured. He liked her a lot, incredibly liked her, and now the fact that she had a husband was an unpleasant obstacle. But now, everything seemed much simpler. Do you need help? Fitzgerald asked. Thank you, but no, Victoria replied confidently. I have to handle this myself. A day later, she became a free woman. No matter how much William tried to claim all the property, the court divided everything equally, and Victoria was satisfied with that. When Stephen fully recovered, he divorced Christina. The woman had much less luck than Victoria's ex-husband, as she ended up with nothing. Before the wedding, the businessman had made a prenuptial agreement to protect himself in such cases. This safeguard turned out to be quite useful. Christina's expensive lawyer couldn't help her, and she ended up having to return to her parents, struggling to make ends meet. When the obstacles in the form of their partners disappeared, Stephen and Victoria began their relationship. They didn't want to rush, allowing the magic that had started between them at their first meeting to develop on its own. Still, Victoria began to visit the businessman often. "I know you," Sylvester exclaimed happily when he saw her. "Dad, this lady came to us and promised that you'd definitely wake up." When Fitzgerald found out that Victoria had supported his son during such a difficult time, his heart was finally melted. At that moment, he realized that he had finally found the woman he had always dreamed of. He proposed to her on a completely ordinary evening when Victoria least expected it. "Do you want red wine or white?" she asked, examining the minibar. "I want you to be my wife," Stephen confidently declared. When the stunned Victoria turned toward him, he was holding out a ring. Yes, the words slipped from her lips instantly. Deep inside, she had been waiting for those words. They got married quickly, as this was Victoria's second marriage and Stephen's third, and neither of them felt the need for an extravagant ceremony. They gathered only a small circle of their closest friends and relatives, then went to the village to have a wedding there and later went on a honeymoon. By that time, Victoria had already moved into her husband's house. She decided to stay in the city, and they hired a manager for the farm, who was also from the village. He was a close friend of her grandfather Victor, whom she trusted, so she was ready to leave the farm in his hands. Victoria didn't visit the farm often, only to check on how things were going. Since businessman Fitzgerald was a well-known figure, his new wife was frequently mentioned in the media. "Look what they're writing about your ex," Ursula said irritably. "Now that's what I call making the right move, and you couldn't even win back the apartment." Since William's divorce, his relationship with Ursula had deteriorated significantly. Since they had split the apartment evenly and soon sold it, Fisher had to move in with his mistress, who wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Ursula began to make many demands, which led to frequent arguments. Over time, she realized that William wasn't as ambitious as she had hoped, and that annoyed her. "What can I do?" her lover replied. The judge was a woman, so she supported Victoria. "You always find excuses just to do nothing," Ursula shook her head. The constant complaints pushed William to prove his worth to his mistress. He didn't want to lose her, especially since he'd started noticing that she had begun flirting with other men. So, Fisher fell for an adventure she had been suggesting for some time. There was a country house that local criminals had been eyeing, but the owners stubbornly refused to sell it. Ursula came up with the idea of forging a couple of documents to facilitate the sale, with a huge commission for herself. At first, William hesitated, but to win his mistress's attention back, he eventually agreed. As a result, the real estate agency became a target for the police. They were aware of the illegal deal and came looking for the guilty party. Ironically, it was Ursula who pointed to her lover. "Sorry, c'est la vie," she shrugged. So, William was convicted of fraud and sent to prison. He faced a trial, and with no one to help him, he was left to face his problems alone. Through mutual acquaintances, Victoria learned about her ex-husband's fate but didn't interfere. Now she had to think about herself. Recently, Victoria's health had seriously deteriorated. She had noticed that she was getting tired quickly and even developed shortness of breath. At one point, she even fainted, which deeply worried her husband. "That's it, this can't go on," Stephen said seriously. "I'm calling my doctor today." Victoria tried to talk him out of it, saying everything would pass on its own, but Stephen wasn't backing down. His beloved's health was his top priority, especially since he had already lost a wife to illness. Now, his biggest fear was that something similar might happen to Victoria. "It's not cancer, is it?" he asked anxiously when the doctor finished the examination. "Don't worry," the doctor smiled. "Everything is perfectly fine. Your wife is just pregnant, and such symptoms are quite common in the early stages." For a moment, silence hung in the room. Each person present was processing what they had just heard. "I'm going to be a mom," Victoria whispered. In the next instant, tears ran down her cheeks. She had almost stopped believing that this was possible. A long time ago, during a medical checkup at work, her gynecologist had told her that she would likely never be able to have children. And back then, Victoria took her word for it and didn't bother getting a second opinion. Moreover, William had never wanted children. Victoria looked at her husband and saw the same emotions in his eyes. It was sincere, infinite happiness.